You're listening to an IOE podcast.
Powered by UCL Minds. This is Academia et al., the podcast for anyone and everyone, figuring out life in academia.
Hi, you're listening to Academia et al., the podcast for early career academics by early career academics. I'm Alina, a senior research fellow in demography at IOE UCL's Faculty of Education and Society. I'm a co-host for this podcast, and like you, I'm an early career academic just trying to figure it all out. In this episode, we're going to discuss media engagement as one form of making an impact. We will answer some very practical questions. Where do the media headlines about research come from? How do I write for the media? And do I even want to? How do I make myself approachable to journalists? How do we track media impact and what it counts for? Joining me in today's conversation is the expert of media relations, Chris Lane. Chris is a deputy head of media relations at UCL. Working in the university's press office, his team sits within the external engagement office to promote UCL's world-leading research and expert comment throughout the global media, whilst also managing issues that may impact UCL's reputation.
Hi there. Thanks very much for having me on.
Thank you, Chris. So you've done a lot of important work around media engagement at UCL. And as our podcast is by early career academics for early career academics, we wanted to take this opportunity and introduce you to our community and to doctoral students who might be struggling to take the first step in engaging with the media. But to begin with, can you please share a bit more about yourself and your career journey?
Sure, yeah. So I initially studied geography and psychology in Canada, and then I developed an interest in journalism, and so I studied a master's in journalism in Vancouver. And while I was there, I started working in a comms office on campus. So I started working in communications and in media relations for a couple of years there before moving to the UK and joining the UCL press office, where I've been for nearly 8 years working in media relations. And yeah, my team, we have various backgrounds. Some do have more scientific backgrounds, more academic backgrounds, whereas some come more from communications or from journalism.
Thank you. So do you think that your first degree helped you somehow in the media work?
It does for some things, in that it does help me with sort of understanding different types of academic papers. I would have come across, similar sort of social sciences or particularly psychology. I do work a lot with actually psychology and neuroscience at UCL, so that has helped somewhat. And just to give me a broader base, I guess, of how academia works.
Yeah, this is great. So would you say it was hard to learn how to become a journalist after studying something else?
I would say that, well, most of the people that I studied with did have different backgrounds as well, which probably makes sense for journalists, really, in that the reason people become journalists is because they're sort of interested in a broad spectrum of things, essentially. I've always liked to learn and then report about it. So I think most of us did have different backgrounds, and that can sort of help to have a bit of an expertise as a journalist or as a press officer in the end.
Absolutely. Thank you. So let's get to some practical tips. So if I'm an early career researcher and just got a paper published, so what would be my next steps? Can you walk us through the process of who we should contact and where do we need to prepare for?
Sure, yeah. So if you've published something that you think could be newsworthy, could be worth sharing more broadly with the general public, beyond just your peers in academia, it's helpful if you please get in touch with someone like me in the press office at UCL. You could also get in touch with your faculty's comms team or other communications professionals that you might have worked with at UCL. We all work quite collaboratively, so if you contact one of us, then we can figure out who will actually sort of lead on it and take things forward. If you have a paper that's coming out, say in an academic journal, it's helpful if you can tell us about it a couple weeks or more before it actually gets published. So often say when a paper is accepted into a journal, that's usually a good time to tell us about it. So that, because if we do want to do some press outreach around it, having advance notice means we can tell journalists about it in advance as well, and just gives us some time to prepare. So please tell us in advance. That's really useful. And also when you do get in touch, it's helpful if you can share not just the research with us, but a few lines, a few sentences about, why you think it's important, why you think it's newsworthy, what's most exciting about it. Just a couple lines of a quick lay summary to help us sort of understand why it's important. And then, if you've contacted me, I'll take a look at it and consider what I think might be the best sort of communications or PR approach for it, channels it might be best suited for. It might be best for. So if it's a really exciting story, then I might be doing a press release and sending it out quite widely, or it might be more suited to a more specialist audience. It might be suited for a news story in faculty channels. Within the IUE, for example, they have a blog where academics can write about their research. So maybe that might be the best place for it. So we'll think about what strategy to take. And then if I do decide to do a press release, I want to share it with journalists and share it quite widely. So generally the process I would go about is I'd like to talk to the academic initially, hear their take on it. They can answer whatever questions I might have. And then once I've sort of understood it, or their take on it, then I would draft the release myself. We don't expect academics to sort of write their own press releases. We can do that for you. We can write up the press release. I would always make sure to get my press release approved by the academics, make sure they're happy with how I've represented the findings. And then, I would start to share it with journalists. If it's quite a big paper, one that we would like to share quite widely, what we often do is we'll send out a press release under embargo a couple of days before the paper is published. So the way that works is, say if the paper's coming out on a Thursday morning, we'll send out a press release on a Tuesday so that journalists have, but just to journalists, so it's shared privately under embargo, so they have a couple days to review the findings, maybe speak to the academic about it before they're allowed to actually publish anything. So all of this does take quite a bit of time. So please tell us well in advance is probably the main point.
Thank you for sharing all that. So for someone who'd never done that before, can you talk a little bit about the difference between the press release or the paper? So it's genuinely, in my understanding, it's something short and it's something that lay audience can understand. So usually all the complex stuff about coefficients and associations is being translated into what your granny would understand. Is that basically more or less it?
Yeah, that's pretty good. Yeah, so the way that we would write a press release is, so it's going to be in plain English. So not using sort of academic language. Sometimes you might need to use a bit of academic language, but only if it's really clearly explained. Something your granny stands as a good way of thinking about it. We would say the way we write is we're sort of assuming the reader doesn't really know anything about this particular topic. But that doesn't mean assuming they're stupid. You can think of them, like a relative or a friend who they will be perfectly intelligent. They just don't know the first thing about this particular topic. And the way that we would write the press release in terms of how we'd structure it, we would start with a headline, a really short, snappy headline that sort of tells really clearly what this is about, what the finding is, ideally in about sort of 7 or 8 words. So we have to be really concise about it to get the point across. And we start out the press release in terms of the first sentence with the main finding. So it's quite a different way of structuring a research paper. You're not sort of starting out with a whole, literature review and all the methods and everything before you finally get to the conclusions on page 10. We have to start off with the main finding and really to draw people in. People don't need to read it, so if they're not interested or they're not drawn in by the first, sentence, then they won't bother. They'll skip it over. So we sort of start out with what's most exciting and then go into the detail as we get further into it.
That sounds really intuitive. One follow-up question on that. So you say that it takes a bit of time and understandable to produce this kind of research output and translate it into media. And then around the embargo time and the article being actually published, it seems to me that the universe speeds up and somehow the journalists pick it up so quickly and write their stories in literally 24 hours to have it on the same day as the article is published. How do they do their job that quickly? Because there's millions of articles that get out every day with loads of press releases, even just within the UK.
Yeah, journalists do work really quickly. They do have to be working on multiple stories every day, churning out multiple stories every day. So that's just how they work. So it's what they've been trained to do. We try to make that really easy for them by providing them with a press release that already really clearly explains the findings. if I've written a press release really well, then sometimes a good way to sort of see if I've done it well is actually if the resulting news articles are written really similarly to my press release, so that they can really quickly churn out an article without having to completely write it from scratch, because we provided them with a press release that already really clearly explains what the finding is. The press releases we write are in a similar style to newspapers and generally news outlets. So we provided them with, a helpful summary and brief explanation of the methods. We also like to provide them with a few quotes from the researchers, which we've sort of, agreed on what the quotes are with the researchers, so that the journalists could just copy and paste those quotes without even needing necessarily to speak directly to the academics. So yeah, if we don't make it easy for them, then they're a lot less likely to publish something, because then it would take them a lot more time to have to sort of start from scratch and do all of that work themselves. Whereas if we've done already a lot of the work ourselves to help them get there, then that they're more able to sort of churn out a whole lot of articles each day.
Oh, that's really interesting. To be honest, I didn't know that they allowed just to take your words and put it into their outlet, because I've been comparing some of the press releases that I've done for my papers, and some of the bigger papers obviously changed it entirely, because I don't think that they're allowed to. So if you're doing something with the BBC, they will write their own piece. They wouldn't just take the words that you've written, my impression.
Well, a press release is designed to be used. Yeah, so it's not copyrighted in the way that a journal article is copyrighted. A press release is designed to be, we're quite happy for people just to copy and paste the entire thing if they want. It's not as simple as that. Obviously, they're generally not going to copy and paste the entire thing. But if they do use some of the wording, then we're really happy with that, because that's the wording that the academics have agreed is, a nice way of describing their work. So, and that's why we sort of spend a lot of time to really try to get the press release, get it right and get it as good as it can be, so that it can really guide the messaging of the journalists.
Just for our users, we're going to put in our short notes some examples of the press releases that has been issued within UCL, and some of the examples how it's been picked up with the media, so that you can see the difference between the paper, the press release, and the final media piece. So, okay, that's all clear now. So as we've discussed, the author's first job is to convince you that it matters. So what is the first thing that you would look at? Would it be something about how timely the research is? So say, is it around the election date, or how groundbreaking it is, or how well written it is? So please share a little bit of what do you actually look for when you read the story?
So there are a few different things that we consider what would make it most newsworthy and of interest to the general public. Right, that it absolutely needs to be timely, and it certainly helps if it is groundbreaking research. But what's the most groundbreaking research from an academic's point of view in terms of what makes a big splash within your field isn't always the same as what would make a bigger splash in the media. Some correlation, but certainly it's probably pretty limited correlation. To be of interest to the news media, the findings have to be really clearly relevant to things that the general public know a bit about and can understand. Which means that, for example, if paper is more about research methods and honing research methods, that may be really important to fellow researchers, but not so much of interest to the general public. And so we really need to consider the implications of the research findings. So will these findings directly affect people's lives or their behaviors, or tell us something really interesting that we didn't know before about our lives and behaviors? We consider whether the results are surprising. So if it was surprising to you as an academic, then please tell us. That's good to know, but particularly newsworthy if it's surprising and unexpected to the general public. Sometimes also if it's just something a bit unusual or a bit quirky, that can make it into the media. I've done press releases on studies at UCL on things like, there was one I did about courtship vocalizations in mice. So essentially about mice singing love songs to one another. It told us interesting things about sort of speech and how that's developed. But just the fact that it was essentially about mice singing love songs to one another made it more interesting. And we happened to be promoting this in February. So it was a nice little Valentine's Day story. If it's sort of a controversial or high profile topic as well. So if it's something that people are talking about a lot right now, if it's relevant to, what's in the news right now, that certainly makes it more interesting, to make it really timely and, why people want to hear about it right now. As you mentioned, if, an election's coming up and we have some new insights into something that is a key point of debate in the election campaign, then yeah, that could make this particular paper more likely to get picked up now than if you'd published it 6 months ago when that topic wasn't in the news. It's not just about the findings themselves, I guess. It really depends on the context and what else is going on that day, that week. So yeah, the same findings might be more newsworthy one day than another day.
Absolutely. Context matter. And it's all about luck because unfortunately, as academics, we can never predict when our papers are going to be published. And sometimes when you write them, you think that they're very timely and very need to go out today, but it takes years to get it out. That's the story of our lives. And just to say something around for our PhD students and early career academics, would you consider taking a paper that's just been published by a PhD student, or would you focus more on kind of someone with already an established academic track?
It doesn't matter to us really who's published it, as long as the research is sound, as long as it looks good. So if it's been published in a peer-reviewed academic journal, then that sounds good to us. If it is sort of a one sole author who's a PhD student in a smaller journal then we might want to check in with another more senior academic just to sort of as a sense check for us to help us gauge how strong the findings are, how strong the research is. But generally speaking, it really doesn't need to be, a leader in the field. If you're a PhD student, you've been researching this for, months or years, then you are already very much an expert, far more about it than almost everyone else does. So we're definitely just as much interested in hearing from PhD students to tenured professors.
Excellent. Early career researchers, you've heard it. You have a paper, get in touch with Chris and his team. So that was very straightforward. Okay, we've published something, we've reached out to your team. Now, what actually happens if we're approached by the media, say radio, for an interview or being asked to comment on something? What should early career researchers do apart from freaking out a little bit?
Well, I would say start by don't freak out a little bit, ideally. Key thing is just don't panic and calm down. And a good first step is to contact the media relations team, as we can offer you some advice that would be specific to that. We can offer plenty of general advice like we're doing here, but if you contact us about a particular interview request that you've received, then we can maybe offer some more specific advice about how to deal with that particular interview. And it's also just helpful for us to know about. You don't need to contact us, but we do sort of like to know what UCL academics are getting up to in the media. And a big thing I would say is just to really trust your expertise. Yeah, you are the expert. Even if you're a PhD student, you have been researching this for months or years. So yeah, you know 1,000 times more about this than most people know about it. People who aren't in your field. A journalist has contacted you clearly because they think you have something interesting to say. They're interested. They think their listeners or their readers will be interested. And so, yeah, trust yourself in your expertise. And then certainly make sure to prepare for the interview in terms of writing down, making some notes about what it is you'd like to say, sort of get your thoughts on paper bits and consider what kind of questions you might be asked. And in preparing for the interview, it's helpful also to ask the journalist just a few questions about what to expect. So you want to make sure to find out, is this for broadcast? So is it for radio? Is it for TV? Is it going to be pre-recorded? If it's pre-recorded, that means if you make a mistake, they can go back out and edit it out. But if it's, or is it going to be live? Or is it going to be for a print article, in a newspaper or written article online? Those are a bit more common generally than the live TV interview isn't really as common. So chances are it's just going to be sort of for print. They're going to be looking for a few sound bites, and they can explain a bit of sort of how that process will work.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So I think just to follow up on what you've just said, one of the academics' greatest fear when interacting with media is that the main message gets lost, or even worse, gets misinterpreted or taken out of context. And you already suggested that we need to try and find out what the purpose of this media piece, but it's not really very straightforward. And academics are usually afraid to make mistakes and to make causal inference and to say that A leads to B unless they've proved it in the paper. But what journalists always want is, so what does it mean for the bigger picture, for the actual real world? These are the kind of questions that we fear because we are specifically told to only talk about in this sample we found out that A and B are related. So do you have any tips on that?
I do hear from a lot of academics who are concerned about how their findings might be misrepresented. One thing to consider is engaging with the media by speaking really openly with them. That helps journalists to get it right. That helps reduce the risk that they're going to misrepresent it, in the sense that they could still report on the story without talking to you directly, and then they're more likely to get it wrong. So you can really help them to understand if you speak to them and engage with them really openly. One thing to keep in mind about journalists is the way that they would be interviewing an academic isn't the same way they'd be interviewing, say, a politician. They're not going to be grilling you and trying to catch you out. They're on your side. They want to get the story right. They want to tell an interesting story about this amazing work that you're doing. So they're working with you on that, really. So just one thing to kind of calm yourself down. And then in terms of to prepare for the interview, a few tips I'd say for how to prepare is to consider, just really think about what the story is you're trying to tell, what agenda you might have in terms of what messaging you're trying to get across, what do you want people to take away from the story. It's helpful to think about having 3 key messages, what sort of the 3 main points you want to get across as 3 really succinct bullet points, so that you can kind of keep that top of mind regardless of what questions you get asked. You can ask ahead of time what questions the journalist will be asking you. They might provide the questions, although they might not provide the questions in advance, or even if they do provide a couple of them, they would want to be able to think on their feet and ask some follow-up questions that they've just thought of. But even if you don't know what they're going to ask you, if you at least have sort of your key messages top of mind, then you can more easily sort of integrate that into your answers, regardless of what exactly the question was. It's also helpful to think about any examples you might have that can sort of bring your story to life in terms of just key facts or observations or anecdotes or sort of statistics that are easy to understand, that really illustrate the story. And also think about just who is the audience that you're ultimately trying to connect with. So that's not just the journalist, but the people who are eventually going to be sort of reading this or listening to this. What is it you especially would want them to know? And to avoid the kind of things going wrong, it's helpful to essentially just think about that in advance. So think about in advance, what are the likely negatives that might come up? What's the sort of worst case scenario headline that you think is sort of a risk to the reporting on your own paper? And so then if you kind of think of what the worst case scenario is, then you can sort of think about, okay, how do I tell it so that doesn't end up misinterpreted like that? Because sometimes you might need to say that in your answer, so we found this, but what this doesn't mean is this, it doesn't mean this, we can't say this, we can't confirm this, just to be really clear on, what the findings do and don't say.
That sounds really helpful. And I just wanted to share some of my experience with our listeners. I've had my article being published as press release with the help of a UCL press release office, and it's been picked up by the BBC. They didn't give me questions in advance, and I asked for them. So that is a very common thing. You ask for them and you don't get them. But then on the day, it was a very, very relaxing half an hour chat, not only about the paper that I published, which was on separation from first partnership, which is something that everyone can understand, because if you've experienced the first partnership, what are the chances that you're going to stay with your first partner and how it has changed across generations? So there was something about the fact that the partnerships are becoming less stable. Well, romantic partnerships, that's what I mean. And it was super relaxing. And we've talked more about my whole PhD thesis about the transition to adulthood. And the piece came out really, really nicely. It was merged with some other academic from the States. And I really enjoyed it. On the contrary, the same article was picked up by The Guardian. And the person who was writing it asked for just a chat with me to talk about different aspects. And that was way later than after the BBC one came out. And we've had a 40 minutes discussion, which was, again, very friendly. But the person who was writing the piece about how young couples marry those days really early. So kind of something like David Beckham's son getting married in his early 20s, and something like, oh, this trend has been revived by the Gen Z. And my point was exactly educating the journalist that the fact that it happened to some celebrity kids, including her own, is not what the majority of the population is experiencing. And the message was very clear that if you have to write the story about it, of course, but I can't say that that's the new trend and that's the new norm because the data shows that it's not. And I actually was very impressed that I have advised the journalists to have a look at the ONS statistics on the growing proportion of couples in cohabitation and the age of marriage and everything that shows kind of to the opposite of what the story was about. And after that, I haven't heard for about a month. And I thought like, well, surely like my 40 minutes were just wasted and nothing is going to come out of it. But I felt like, my scientific purpose, I educated the journalist and tried to make the story more plausible. And I was very impressed that in the end, the story did come out, but they actually did look at all the stats that I recommended looking at ONS. They did cite these kind of publications that I mentioned. They included my short commentary on some of the trends from my paper, which did not back up the main story. But I was very impressed that it was kind of the high level of journalism where they didn't get out of me what they really wanted to support their story, but yet they made sense out of it despite it all. So I don't know how often it happens, and maybe our listeners also have some similar stories that happen to them. But I just thought that it's worth sharing that sometimes you think that it doesn't go alone. And I tried to make my point clear very many times during the interview. This is not what we observe in the research. So this is a very niche trend. And yet it worked out well in the end.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And that you've made some quite good points there about what to do, I think, in the sense that, for one thing, I think the fact that it sounds like it was, you were really, when you were having conversation with the journalist, you were really sort of listening to what they were saying and what kind of story they wanted to tell. So you kind of picked out that they wanted to tell a certain story that wasn't quite accurate. And then you responded to that by really helping them get it right. And yeah, providing them with additional materials that can be really helpful, pointing them to other data that wasn't necessarily your own work, but just to really help them understand the story and make sure they get it right. And then you said that you were worried that you'd wasted your time if that article didn't come out. But I would say you haven't necessarily wasted your time. If the article never did come out, then it might not be a waste of time in that you would have at least avoided an inaccurate article from coming out. And so sometimes media engagement might not necessarily lead to something being published, but that doesn't mean it's a waste of time, because it's still really useful in educating the journalists and making sure that the coverage that they end up doing is accurate, or that they don't tell a story that's completely inaccurate.
That's absolutely a great way of seeing that. If you stop from incorrect message getting out to the public, that's also a result. Much harder to quantify, but nevertheless a very important result. Okay, so moving on to some other practical skills. So we talked a lot about giving interviews, and if we come back to writing at the first place, so would you have any tips for our listeners on getting their work out there, and specifically what to focus on if they write a blog themselves? And prove me wrong, so blogs are usually written by the authors, right? Not by your team. Or can there be a collaboration on that as well?
Yeah, a blog would be written by academics themselves, typically. And then press release or a pitch to the media, we would write it ourselves. And we also often support academics in getting articles into, say, The Conversation or other news outlets as well that publish articles, not just in UCL's own channels, but externally, that are written by academics. And we can certainly support you in advising how to write that. So I guess generally, if you're writing for a general audience, a lay audience, it's important to consider what's most interesting about your findings, that, what would really capture the attention of someone that isn't in your field. I mean, sometimes you can sort of test this even just by talking to your friends or your family about your work and see what is it that they're most interested in. It's a bit of a litmus test. But also, of course, a comms professional like me, we can also help you with that. But often the sort of headline of your story, the key finding, might not actually be the key finding of your research. There might be something else that's a bit more interesting to a general audience. In writing a news article, writing something for a general audience, we always have to start with a really short, snappy headline and then lead with sort of the key finding. You have to be able to really succinctly explain what the story is. So for our press releases, we always have a sort of one sentence lead sentence, and that tells the whole story in one sentence. Later in the piece, we'll go into more detail, but you need to be able to find a way of sort of saying what the story is in just one sentence before then getting into more detail. And yeah, just try to be really clear and write really in plain English, avoid technical terms, avoid academic terms that the general public might not understand. You may have been using these terms for a decade, but just, need to keep in mind that they might not be as obvious to the general public. And no one's going to complain because something is too easy to understand. Whereas, if it's too hard to understand, it might just go over their head and they won't keep reading it. But there's nothing wrong with just making something really simple and clear. And if you do have a challenging concept that you want to introduce, make sure to just explain it. And also try to really make every line count. So particularly as someone is reading through the piece, each sentence has to sort of keep their interest in reading the next sentence, which is why we tend to keep a lot of the detail we might leave a bit more towards the end of the piece. So we'd sort of start out with, what's the main finding? What's most important? What are the key implications? And then we sort of go into the methods and, maybe some kind of further questions, opportunities for further research and things towards the end, just for the people that are really interested and have made it all the way to the bottom of the page.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think one thing I wanted to add is to kind of stand your ground. And especially I've heard a lot of stories then when writing for conversation, the conversation's editorial team is huge and you never know what kind of expert you get and what are their views on specific topic. And I've heard a lot from colleagues that they had to delete the messages that were added last minute because they do not support the findings of the researchers, but the editor thought that that's a good kind of big headline phrase. And I think that's usually hard to, especially in your early career, to know how to say no to certain things that the editor might be trying to bring in. I think that's kind of one of the challenges, I would say.
Yeah, and just explain why it is that you feel that way, why it is that this really has to be in there, it's super important, or why is it that this particular phrasing isn't correct, and just take the time to explain to an editor, a journalist who isn't an expert in your field, and it might seem like they're sort of pushing back, they want to do things a certain way, but once you've just explained why it is that this message has to get across in a certain way, once they understand, they may well entirely agree with you.
Okay, so we're coming closer to the end of our conversation, and I only have 2 questions left. So one of them is about training. So I know UCL offers a lot of media and engagement training. Can you talk a little bit more about what to expect at this and how our listeners may engage with this?
Yeah, so UCL's media relations team, we offer media relations training sessions both centrally through organizational development that are open to academics in sort of across UCL, and it's open sort of anyone from PhD students to senior research staff. And we also offer training sessions that are specific to different faculties that we do offer those pretty regularly, working with faculty communications teams. Through that, most of them are offered as webinars, but we do sometimes also offer in-person ones. We cover a lot of what we talked about today. Essentially, we cover who the media relations team is, who we are, what we do, how we get UCL into the media. We talk about the benefits of doing media engagement, how it can benefit you and how it can benefit the general public, essentially. We talk about how we go about promoting research and expertise. We talk about what stories hit the news, in terms of which kind of research stories are more likely to get covered, and the different news and media channels that might cover your stories. And we also do go through some examples in depth to explain exactly how we got the results that we did, and also exactly, why these particular examples why these were strong stories and why we covered those and why journalists were particularly interested in them.
That sounds really good. So everyone who's listening, sign up to those courses if you want to learn more and if you want to have your hands-on on some practical examples, which are impossible in a podcast format. We've learned a lot today. Thank you, Chris. To finish on a philosophical note, one last question. We've learned that there are many ways to engage with media and how to disseminate our work. Can you share some of your final thoughts on the benefits of engaging with media?
Yeah, so one key obvious benefit is that, of course, it sort of raises your profile, and that in doing that, it raises UCL's profile. That's why we have a whole team of people here to help you out with it. It also raises your department's profile. So, say if you're in the IOE, it helps share that UCL is really a place for expertise in education research specifically, or whatever exactly it is that you're researching. And it can raise your own personal profile. It seems that that's sort of increasingly important these days in terms of from employers' perspectives or funders' perspectives, that you're making an impact with your research beyond just the research community. So it is good for relationships with funders and with other partners and collaborators if they see that you're promoting this collaborative relationship and the results of the work that you're doing. I think another argument is that most of the work done at UCL is publicly funded, and I think that the public sort of has a right to know where their money's going, essentially. So publicly funded research should be communicated to the public, and it helps just to showcase the value of universities, and so that people know why it's important that universities are funded and that research is funded because of, if we tell them what the results are. And I think you can also think about it as sort of an extension of your role as educators. You're not just educating your students. If you're teaching, you're not just educating your peers, other people in your field, but you're also, if you do media engagement, you're also educating the public. And that could be, you might be able to sort of debunk some myths that you might have seen about relating to your field. You might be able to sort of enact some change through more dialogue and openness and sharing your expertise.
Chris, we have a tradition of asking our guests to share a tip of the day with our listeners. What would be your one tip of engaging with media today?
I would say my top tip would be to trust yourself and trust your expertise. You don't need to be the top expert in the field. You've been researching this for months. You've been researching this for years. You know 1,000 times more about this topic than most people outside of your field. So trust that you are an expert, and that also that journalists are on your side. They're not trying to catch you out. They're just trying to tell a really interesting story. And it's a collaborative thing dealing with the media to get the best story across.
One thing to add, if you want to be approached by media journalists, register at Expert at UCL. You can find the link in our show notes. And this is the database of UCL experts. And it would be much easier for the journalists to find you if you register there. Chris, thank you so much for your time and expertise today.
Thanks very much, Alina. Thanks for having me on, and I hope this has been really useful for our listeners.
Thank you for listening to Academia et al. I'm Alina Pelikh, and thanks for joining us today. This season has been brought to you with the support from the Doctoral School Researcher Networks and Academic Societies Fund. You can follow the IUE Early Career Network on X, their website formerly known as Twitter, at IUE_early career. If you liked what you've heard, have suggestions for content, or want to be our next podcast guest, send us an email at iue.earlycareer@ucl.ac.uk. And a quick favor before you go. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, we'd really appreciate it if you could give the IUE podcast a rating. 5 stars would be nice if you're really enjoying the show. And that will also help us to reach more people who would be interested in hearing about us. Thanks for listening.
Academia et al. Is brought to you by the IOE's Early Career Network. This podcast is presented by Dr. Kerry Wong and Dr. Alina Pelikh. The theme music was created by Ronnie Shu. Amy Leibowitz is the series producer, and Sarah Jane Gregory is the executive producer.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast.